A Patriots Faith, Chapter 9. Bryce Leonard drove the Bronco aggressively. Paul Connor was in the front seat next to him, and Carson Lee sat in the back. They were making their way up into the hills of western Pennsylvania, speeding along a bumpy gravel road. Carson was holding on to stop himself from being bounced up against the ceiling. Bryce caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror and smiled broadly at him. He yelled out over the road noise in the cab, "Hang on, Ranger!" He jerked the wheel to the right, sliding the truck onto a narrow, washed-out road that led them further away from civilization. Paul was forced to grab the handhold above the passenger's door to keep himself from flying across the cab into Bryce's side. Bryce looked over at him, again smiling, and yelled out, "Hoorah!" Both passengers relaxed when the road became so narrow that Bryce had to slow to a crawl to navigate it successfully. Paul looked over at Bryce and asked, "You know these roads pretty good, huh? You grow up around here, man?" Bryce retorted quickly, "What are you doing, writing a book there, Chief? Didn't they teach you young'uns nothing about minding your own business? You knowing where I grew up isn't mission critical now, is it, son?" Paul paused for a moment, not knowing what to say. Before he could manage an attempt at an answer, Bryce let out a roar of a laugh and slapped Paul on the back of the shoulder, almost sending him into the dashboard. "I'm just messing with you, son." The look on your face was priceless. Bryce just shook his head. "Gets you guys every time. Man, you young'uns gotta lighten up a bit. Life's too short to be so serious all the time." Paul looked back at Carson, who was watching from the back seat. They followed the road up and around the corner, where the landscape opened up to a beautiful view of the valley below and the mountains beyond it. There sat a small board and batten cabin. It had a stone fireplace which made up one complete gable wall. Smoke trickled from the chimney. As Bryce pulled the Bronco up to the raised beds that sat between the driveway and the house, the door opened, and out came a petite woman and two German shepherds, which dashed out behind her and made their way around her, arriving at the Bronco first. Bryce greeted them. "Joshua, Caleb, heel, boys!" The shepherds ran to Bryce and sat beside him. "Good boys," he said, with an approving tone. He snapped his fingers and they got up and ran back to the woman. Bryce announced, "Paul, Carson, this is Eleanor, my wife." Eleanor smiled and nodded at them, extending her hand. Paul and Carson both shook her hand. "Call her Bear," Bryce said. Paul looked at Bryce inquisitively. "It's a long story," Bryce told him. "Maybe sometime I'll tell it to you." He smiled. Eleanor hugged the big man and said, "The quads are gassed and loaded. I radioed ahead. They're expecting you." Bryce kissed his wife goodbye, and the three men walked around the cabin to a barn out back. Eleanor called the dogs to her side and told them, "You boys are staying here with Mama tonight. Dad'll be back in the morning." They whimpered, and she patted them on their heads. I know. Me too, boys. Me too." She heard the quad start up and head up the trail to the rear of the property. She looked up into the star-filled night. "Lord, they're in your hands. Grant them safety. In Jesus' name." She snapped her finger. "Come on, boys. Let's get inside where it's warm." The shepherds followed her in, and she shut the door behind them. 2 hours later, deep in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, Bryce led the convoy of quads up the trail. Bryce reached the top of a ridge and cut his engine. Paul and Carson pulled up behind him and did the same. "What's up, Bryce?" Carson asked. "We wait," was all he said. "Smoke 'em if you got 'em, Rangers." Neither Carson or Paul smoked. Bryce pulled out a hand-rolled cigarette from a handmade leather pouch in his coat. He lit it up and sat back on the quad. Several minutes went by, and he heard a motor, and then saw headlights coming up the trail from the other side of the ridge. Bryce crushed out his smoke and said, "This is us, boys. Get ready to go." Bryce pulled his Olight baton from his coat pocket and flashed it down the trail, turning it on and off 3 times in quick succession. The approaching quad slowed and then accelerated into a U-turn, hole-shotting out back the way he came. Bryce, Paul, and Carson followed him deeper into the woods. Another hour passed by, and they reached the encampment. Without Carson or Paul realizing it, they had passed through a series of checkpoints leading up to the camp perimeter. The camp commanding officer was expecting them and was ready to see them. He allowed Bryce time to park the quads and get the boys in the mess tent for a fresh cup of hot coffee before coming in and introducing himself. As he walked in and approached the table where the 3 men sat, Carson Lee thought he recognized him. The man was familiar, but with a cap brim pulled low over his forehead. Carson wasn't sure who he was or where he knew him from. The man got himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table next to Bryce, opposite Paul and Carson. As soon as he sat down, it hit Carson who he was. Carson hesitated for a moment when the man offered his hand to him. "Carson Lee, long time. How are you?" "John?" Carson said, perplexed. "John, it is you. What are you doing out here?" he asked. John Hoven, Republican senator from North Dakota, sat opposite Carson. He shook his hand and shook hands with Paul and Bryce as well. "I work here on my off time," he quipped with a chuckle. "Actually, Carson, I run this camp, and several others like it around the nation. I'm glad you boys made it out so quickly. I'm sorry for pulling you away from the wives with no notice, dragging you out here. But what I have to say needed to be said in person, and it's time sensitive, as I know Ken Fowler's told you." Carson just stared at his senatorial colleague, still not believing he was here. "How do you know Ken?" Paul asked. John Hoven looked over at him. "Well, Paul, most of that is classified." He managed a light smile. "But I can tell you that we've been friends and associates for some time. I appreciate you boys being here, and I'm going to get right to the point of why you were brought out here." He looked directly at Carson Lee. "I've got a meeting with Joel McAdams day after tomorrow, Carson, and I'd like you to come with me." This surprised Carson. He looked at Paul and back at John. "He's part of this group too?" Carson asked. Then he thought to himself, "What did I get us into?" John Hoven let out a strong laugh. "Oh, goodness, no. Joel McAdams is too big of a narcissistic blowhard to be part of anything serving the greater good of this nation. The only interests he serves are those of Joel McAdams. He doesn't know this group exists, but it just so happens that I share a common objective with him. And so, the meeting tomorrow." "Common objective?" Carson asked. John Hoven hesitated for a moment. "Yes, Carson, I'm afraid so. It's no secret that McAdams wants you to remain in the Senate. And, well, frankly, so do I." "So do we." Carson looked at him completely blindsided. "Stay in the Senate? That's not possible. I resigned. I'm done with all that for good. I'm not going back, he said matter-of-factly. Well, Carson, I understand your frustration, and I respect it. As Ken told you yesterday, we're going to ask you to make a big sacrifice. That's why your membership was fast-tracked with us. We need you in the chamber, my friend. We need your seat. We're stronger with you than without you. The meeting with McAdams in a couple days is to announce that you've reconsidered and decided to run for another term after all. Carson, I know this isn't what you wanted, but it's how you can serve most effectively. Carson, listen, we can't compel you to do it. You and Paul and Bryce are spending the night here tonight. Bryce is going to introduce you to some of the others tomorrow. I want you to get a clear picture of what we're doing here. When you leave tomorrow, you'll have 24 hours before we fly to D.C. You consider this seriously, son. If you decide not to do it, you'll be excused from the group with no hard feelings or retributions from anyone. The men stood up together, and John shook Carson's hand. Carson, we need you with us. What we are doing here is huge, and the fate of the nation that we both grew up in is at stake here. I pray you make the right decision. Good night, son. I'll talk to you in 36 hours. He shook Paul's hand and Bryce's hand, and turned and walked out of the mess tent, and rode off in a convoy of quads into the darkness.